A teacher thought she could humiliate a quiet black boy by forcing him to play the piano in front of the whole class. But what happened next left every single student stunned and left the teacher absolutely speechless. This isn't just a story about music. It's about hidden talent, prejudice, and the powerful moment when truth silences hate. You there, yes you, sit at the piano. Let's see if you can even press the right keys. Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the room like a knife, sharp and dripping with mockery. Every head in the classroom turned at once, eyes locking on the boy she was addressing, David. 14 years old, tall for his age but with a softness to his features that made him look younger. He stood by the wall, shoulders slightly hunched, clutching the strap of his worn backpack as though it could shield him from the weight of her words. The music classroom, usually buzzing with chatter, fell into an uneasy silence. The only sound was the squeak of Mrs. Thompson's shoes as she paced near the piano, her eyes never leaving David. He had been at this school for only a few weeks, a new face in a place where everyone else already seemed to know one another. For most teachers, he was just another student trying to find his footing. But to Mrs. Thompson, he was an easy target. From day one, she had zeroed in on him. She made sly remarks about his accent, poked fun at the way he dressed, and rolled her eyes whenever he raised his hand. It wasn't discipline. It wasn't guidance. It was cruelty, thinly veiled behind the authority of a teacher's voice, and today, she had decided to escalate. The grand piano gleamed under the classroom lights, its polished surface reflecting every nervous face in the room. Mrs. Thompson gestured toward it with a mocking flourish, as if offering David a stage not for glory, but for humiliation. David's classmates exchanged glances. Some smirked, anticipating a spectacle. A few whispered under their breath, their giggles bubbling up in cruel harmony. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pity flickering in their eyes but drowned out by the fear of drawing the teacher's wrath themselves. David's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't afraid of the piano. No, the piano was familiar, a friend from his childhood. But here, under the glare of Mrs. Thompson and the expectant stares of his classmates, the instrument had been twisted into a weapon. This wasn't about music. This wasn't about learning. This was about power, about making him small, about breaking him in front of everyone. And the cruel smile curling on Mrs. Thompson's lips told him she couldn't wait to watch him fail. What no one in that room knew was that David carried a secret. Far from the polished floors of this school, back in the small neighborhood where he grew up, the piano wasn't just an instrument, it was a piece of his soul. His grandmother had been the one to place his small fingers on the keys when he was barely old enough to reach them. Evening after evening, she sat beside him, her voice soft and steady, guiding him through scales, teaching him to let his heart speak through the music. To David, the piano was never about impressing anyone. It was about healing. Each note was a memory, a fragment of warmth, a reminder of the love that had shaped him. And in those quiet hours, he had learned something powerful. Music could transform pain into beauty. But here, in this classroom, surrounded by mocking eyes and under the sharp glare of Mrs. Thompson, that gift had remained locked away. He never spoke about it. He never played a single note for his peers. The risk of judgment, of ridicule, of being laughed at, it was too heavy a burden. And now, all eyes were on him. Mrs. Thompson's voice was sharp, dripping with disdain. "Well, are you just going to stand there? Sit down and try, if you even know how." The students leaned forward in their chairs, some with smirks tugging at their lips. They weren't expecting music. They were expecting a disaster. They were expecting David to stumble, to press the wrong notes, to prove once and for all that he didn't belong. David hesitated. His legs felt like stone as he shuffled toward the grand piano. Its polished surface reflected the room like a mirror, capturing every tense face, every whisper. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the bench. His hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. He could feel the heat of 100 eyes pressing into his back, waiting for him to fail. His heart thudded in his chest, loud enough he thought the others might hear it. For a moment, he considered pulling back, retreating into silence. But then, just for a second, he remembered his grandmother's words. "Play as if the world doesn't exist. Just you and the piano." David drew in a deep breath, steadied his hands, and let his fingers touch the keys. The classroom braced for humiliation, but something very different was about to happen. The room was so still that David could hear his own breath. Between the notes, Mrs. Thompson, who had been poised to mock him, leaned slightly forward, her sharp expression faltering with each passing measure. What began as hesitant taps on the keys quickly transformed into something else entirely. The melody grew wings soaring above the walls of the classroom. His fingers, once trembling, now moved with fluid grace, gliding across the ivory like they had been waiting for this moment all along. Every chord carried weight. Every note spoke of resilience, of pain and hope braided together. The students sat transfixed. The snickers and whispers evaporated, leaving only wide eyes and parted lips. Even the rowdy kids at the back, the ones who never paid attention to anything, leaned forward, captivated by the sound. It wasn't just music. It was a story. A story of quiet strength, of nights spent practicing when no one was watching, of a boy who carried the echoes of his grandmother's love in his hands. The song swelled, wrapping the room in warmth until it felt like time itself had stopped to listen. Mrs. Thompson's arms, once crossed, slowly dropped to her sides. The smirk she had been preparing never came. Instead, she stared at David with something between disbelief and shame. She had wanted to expose him, to humiliate him, but in trying to tear him down, she had revealed his brilliance. David's classmates glanced at one another, as if silently asking, "Is this really the same quiet kid we ignored?" The answer was written all over their faces, yes and no. He was the same boy, but now, through his music, they saw him in a way they never had before. The final note rang out, strong and clear, hanging in the air like a truth that couldn't be denied. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence after his performance was louder than any applause. David lifted his hands from the keys and rested them in his lap, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had just shared. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't need to, because in that silence he knew. They had heard him, truly heard him, and nothing in that classroom would ever be the same again. No one could deny it anymore. David had talent that surpassed anything they'd seen in that classroom before. The boy they had barely noticed, the one Mrs. Thompson tried to tear down, had just commanded the room with nothing but music. The applause grew louder, echoing off the walls. Some students whistled, others pounded their desks in excitement. A few even shouted his name, as though he had just finished performing on a grand stage rather than in a classroom meant to embarrass him. David sat frozen at the piano, unsure how to respond. He hadn't played for recognition. He had played because he couldn't hold the music inside any longer. His grandmother's voice seemed to echo in his mind, reminding him, "The music will speak for you when words cannot." And tonight, it had spoken louder than anything he could have said. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson stood stiffly at the front of the room. Her authority, once unquestioned, now hung in tatters. She opened her mouth to speak but quickly shut it again when the applause only grew stronger. Every pair of eyes had turned from her to David, and no one cared for her opinion anymore. For years she had relied on fear and mockery to control her students. But fear had no place here now. Respect had shifted. Power had shifted. "Enough," she snapped, her voice cracking slightly. But the command rang hollow, drowned out by the continued cheers. Even she knew it. Her words no longer held weight. Finally, the clapping slowed and the students returned to their seats. But the energy in the room had changed. They no longer looked at David with pity or silence. They looked at him with admiration, with newfound respect. Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat, her face still flushed. "Well," she muttered awkwardly, "it seems you surprised us all." It was the closest thing to an admission of defeat she could bring herself to say, but everyone knew the truth. She hadn't just been surprised, she had been humbled. David stood quietly, pushing the piano bench back. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded once as if to say thank you, then walked back to his seat with quiet dignity. And in that moment, he wasn't just the quiet new kid anymore. He was the boy who had turned humiliation into triumph. The boy whose music had left even his harshest critics speechless. That day became a turning point, not only for David but for the entire school. Word of his performance spread quickly, whispered through hallways, repeated at lunch tables, and carried home in the excited voices of his classmates. By the next morning, everyone knew about the new boy who had stunned Mrs. Thompson's class into silence with his piano skills. Students who had barely noticed him before now greeted him in the halls, asking questions, offering smiles and showing him a respect he had never felt here before. David, still modest, kept his head down. He hadn't played for fame or attention. He had simply allowed the music to speak when he had no words. Yet whether he wanted it or not, the way people saw him had changed forever. Teachers began encouraging him to share his gift at school events. Friends asked him to teach them little tunes. Some even pushed him toward competitions, insisting that talent like his couldn't stay hidden. For the first time since transferring schools, David felt like he truly belonged. But perhaps the most surprising change came from Mrs. Thompson. In the days that followed, she avoided eye contact with him, her pride still raw from being exposed in front of her own students. But slowly her tone shifted. The harsh edge in her voice softened when she spoke to him. She no longer singled him out for ridicule, and though she never offered a direct apology, her actions betrayed a newfound respect, and perhaps a quiet shame she wasn't ready to admit aloud. For David, none of this was about revenge. He hadn't wanted to humiliate his teacher. He hadn't wanted to prove anyone wrong. All he wanted was to be himself, to share the music that had carried him through difficult times. What mattered most was that he had stayed true to who he was, and in doing so, he had turned prejudice into silence and mockery into admiration. Months later, at the school talent show, David stepped onto the stage with confidence. The auditorium was packed. His classmates cheered before he even touched the keys. When he began to play, the music was even more powerful than before. Polished, emotional, unforgettable. The standing ovation that followed shook the walls, and even Mrs. Thompson clapped along. A faint but genuine smile on her face, David had gone from being mocked and underestimated to becoming a symbol of resilience and talent. And the very piano once used to shame him had become the instrument of his greatest triumph. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful and inspiring stories. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.